One of the most remarkable achievements of Mikhail Gorbachev as the leader of the Soviet Union was his role in ending the Cold War and reducing the threat of nuclear annihilation. Gorbachev realized that the arms race was draining the Soviet economy and undermining his efforts to reform the communist system. He also shared a vision with U.S. President Ronald Reagan of a world free of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev initiated a series of bold proposals to reduce the nuclear arsenals of both superpowers and to ban all nuclear tests. In January 1986, he announced a plan to eliminate all nuclear weapons by the year 2000. Although many U.S. officials dismissed this idea as propaganda, Reagan welcomed it and responded with his own offer to eliminate all ballistic missiles. The two leaders met face-to-face several times to discuss their proposals and to overcome the obstacles that stood in their way. One of the main sticking points was Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a program to develop a space-based missile defense system that Gorbachev feared would give the U.S. an advantage in a nuclear war. Reagan refused to abandon SDI, but he assured Gorbachev that it was not intended to undermine deterrence or to violate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. In October 1986, at their summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, Reagan and Gorbachev came close to agreeing on a historic deal that would have eliminated all nuclear weapons within 10 years, but they failed to reach a final agreement because of their differences over SDI. Despite this setback, they continued to pursue arms control negotiations and made significant progress in other areas. In December 1987, they signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles that were deployed in Europe and posed a serious risk of escalation. This was the first treaty that actually reduced the number of nuclear weapons rather than just limiting their growth. It also established unprecedented verification measures, such as on-site inspections and data exchanges, to ensure compliance by both sides. In July 1991, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Bush and Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, which cut the number of strategic nuclear warheads by about 40% and limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and bombers. This treaty also included rigorous verification procedures and reduced the risk of accidental or unauthorized launch. Gorbachev's willingness to negotiate with the United States and other countries on nuclear disarmament was a key factor in ending the Cold War and creating a new era of cooperation and trust. He showed remarkable courage and foresight in challenging the entrenched interests and ideologies that had sustained the nuclear confrontation for decades. He also demonstrated a genuine commitment to peace and human survival in a world threatened by nuclear weapons. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union, a communist superpower that collapsed in 1991. He is widely credited for ending the Cold War and changing the world with his policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. But his reforms also faced resistance and opposition from hardliners and nationalists within the Soviet Union and its allies. Gorbachev's perestroika aimed to modernize the Soviet economy and society by introducing elements of market competition, private ownership, decentralization, and democratization. He also sought to reduce the military spending and the ideological confrontation with the West. But these changes threatened the interests and privileges of the communist elite, who feared losing their power and influence. They also alarmed some conservatives, who saw them as a betrayal of socialism and a surrender to capitalism. Gorbachev's glasnost aimed to increase the transparency and accountability of the government and the party by allowing more freedom of expression, information, and criticism. He also encouraged dialogue and cooperation with other political forces and social movements. But these changes exposed the problems and corruption of the Soviet system, as well as the grievances and aspirations of various ethnic groups and regions. They also unleashed a wave of dissent and protest that challenged the authority and legitimacy of the regime. Some of Gorbachev's opponents tried to stop or reverse his reforms by using their positions in the party, the government, the military, or the media. They criticized him for being weak, indecisive, naive, or reckless. They also tried to undermine him by spreading rumors, propaganda, or misinformation. They formed factions, alliances, or conspiracies to resist or sabotage his policies. They also appealed to nationalist or populist sentiments to mobilize support against him. One of the most dramatic examples of opposition to Gorbachev was the coup attempt in August 1991, when a group of communist hardliners called the State Emergency Committee declared a state of emergency and put Gorbachev under house arrest while he was on vacation in Crimea. They claimed that they were acting to save the Soviet Union from chaos and disintegration, but they were actually trying to prevent him from signing a new treaty that would transform it into a more democratic and decentralized federation. The coup failed after 3 days, thanks to the resistance of Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, who rallied thousands of people to defend democracy in Moscow, and the defection of some military units that refused to obey the orders of the coup leaders. Another example of opposition to Gorbachev was the rise of nationalist movements in some Soviet republics, especially in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been annexed by Stalin in 1940. They demanded independence from Moscow and refused to recognize its authority. They also organized mass demonstrations, strikes, and civil disobedience campaigns to assert their sovereignty. They declared their restoration of independence in 1990 to 1991, despite Gorbachev's attempts to persuade them to stay within a reformed Soviet Union. They were supported by some Western countries, which recognized their independence after the coup attempt. Gorbachev's reforms ultimately led to his own downfall, as he lost control over both his allies and his enemies. He was unable to satisfy the demands or expectations of either side, as he tried to balance between reform and stability, between democracy and socialism, between unity and diversity. He was also unable to prevent or manage the economic crisis, the political turmoil, and the social unrest that resulted from his reforms. He resigned on December 25, 1991, after most Soviet republics declared their independence and formed a new Commonwealth of Independent States. The Soviet Union ceased to exist on December 31, 1991,